My name is Cade Foster, Subject 117. I've been tested. I'm their experiment. They set out to destroy my life like they've done to so many others. They think they can simply wipe me out. Wipe us all out. It could be anybody. Anywhere. It was predicted they would arrive in waves. Well, the first wave is here. Tonight, on Channel 5. All I can do is warn you.
Tell us how you first discovered you were addicted to sex.
What?
Take a look at these.
Chinese Takeout, Samo Style, in martial law, Tuesdays at 7 on 5.
Isn't the saying it ain't how it used to be? So what was a Victorian seaside holiday like then?
Hello. Do you remember those seaside holidays you had as a child? Buckets and spades, sticky candy floss and all that sand in your sandwiches. Having a paddle or walking along the prom. And of course, if you were very lucky, Big Dippers or Dodgems and all the fun of the fair. Our coast is scattered with seaside resorts and they all have different characters. But going to the seaside is a relatively recent tradition and many of our well-loved resorts only really got going in Victorian times. Now, the Victorians had the same fascination for seaside gifts that we have, and on the table here, I've got some of the things that you might have bought or received if you've been around in the last century. I think this photograph encapsulates it all. It was taken in the 1890s, and it really does show you've got the bathing houses, and you can see them both set back, and then they pulled them forwards, because of course it was only very decent if you were in your bathing costume if you were actually at the water's edge. So you'd change in your bathing hut and then you'd wheel it out to the sea here and then you'd pop in the water. With the advancing of photography in the Victorian era, you could actually take home something like this. It's a commemorative album and has lots of images of your favourite seaside resort. And if you had a little bit more money, this is the kind of thing that you might like to afford. It's a stereoscope. Just pop your images in, look up, and you've got that vision of the seaside to take home. Today, we're going to look at how one of the most famous seaside resorts developed, and just see if you can work out which one it is.
When you're by the sea, what is it makes you feel so fine? It's the air, I tell you, it's the air. There's oxo in the oxygen and bovril in the brine. You talk about your dumbbells and your best port wine. Your heart begins to palpitate, your nose begins to shine. You feel your lungs expanding as you wander by the shore.
Well, yes, that really did give the game away, didn't it? Blackpool, said to be the first seaside resort to set out to attract the industrial working class. But even that most potent symbol of Blackpool, the tower, is a fairly recent addition. It was completed in 1894. Blackpool's popularity and reputation originated in the last half of the 19th century. As we're about to see, the town began to cater for the working class visitor at a time when other resorts around our coastline were easily genteel and middle class. Blackpool in the 1890s, and in its own way, Blackpool remains very much a Victorian town whose business happens to be pleasure. By the end of the 19th century, it was a playground for workers from all over the north of England and the Midlands. But as you might expect, the Victorian seaside had as many divisions of class and culture as there were elsewhere, and at the beginning of the 19th century, Blackpool was a small and rather remote resort for the middle classes. The Blackpool of the 1830s and early 1840s gave few hints at what was to come. There were a few houses along the seafront, but nothing that matched the scale or refinement of resorts such as Scarborough or Brighton. Blackpool's main attractions were the sea and a wide stretch of sand. But above all, it was seen as a health resort, where sea bathing and drinking seawater were to be recommended. There was a working-class Lancashire tradition of sea bathing at the August spring tides, when it was thought there was a physic in the sea. In the early part of the 19th century, these humbler visitors mingled with those the Victorians saw as more respectable. The cream of Lancashire society went to Harrogate or Scarborough. This all changed with the railway's arrival in the town in 1846. Talbot Road Station brought what was still a Lancashire village into contact with the great industrial areas of Yorkshire and the Midlands. In 45 years, Blackpool was to grow into a town with over 1.5 million visitors a year. As Blackpool developed, it had to adjust the volume of people that came out of the station, and then passed down this central route straight through the town, which led directly to the seafront. The land was owned by a local family, the Cliftons of Lytham. In the 1840s, they drew up plans to develop this central area into detached and semi-detached villas, with large gardens and crunchy gravel drives. But soon after the railway arrived, they changed their minds, as they realised the effect crowds of visitors streaming past the garden gates every weekend would have on the potential house buyers. So instead of building a smart estate of villas in the centre of Blackpool, the Cliftons decided to lease plots of land to individual developers, who put up 4 times as many houses in the same space. This preference for a quick buck rather than planned upmarket development was to be characteristic of Blackpool in the following years. The result was cheerful, cramped and, of course, busy, and without any of the privacy valued by the middle class. Added to this, the set paved streets made it very noisy for a place that was supposed to be a holiday resort. There couldn't have been more of a contrast with the genteel villas of nearby Lytham, which were built by the Clifton family to attract the well-to-do of Lancashire society. Other resorts around the country, like Rhyl in North Wales, were also being developed to meet the needs of the prosperous middle Victorian classes. And Scarborough itself, the pinnacle of respectability among northern resorts, was being developed with the right tone to maintain its appeal to the cream of society. Now, with all this planned and very refined building going on, the central development that had taken place in Blackpool made it difficult for the resort to compete in this expanding middle-class holiday market. It was not going to attract the social elite of the new industrial millionaires, but it had begun to acquire an unpretentious atmosphere which didn't intimidate its working-class visitors. Some of Blackpool, at least, was designed to be upmarket. In 1863, the seafront, north of the existing built-up area known as Claremont Park, came into the hands of the Blackpool Land Building and Hotel Company. This Manchester-dominated consortium had decided to build substantial cliff-top terraces for prosperous residents and summer visitors. Lansdowne Crescent, however grand it may look to our eyes, is the only Victorian crescent in Blackpool. To keep the whole area quiet and select, a toll of 1 penny was charged to all non-residents wanting to pass along the seafront. And of course, there was no question of pubs, stalls and open-air museums. They were all forbidden. The Imperial Hotel was part of this development. It was to become the town's most expensive and upmarket establishment. Claremont Park was vital to Blackpool's mid-Victorian economy, and it's still known today as Claremont Park. Although much altered, it's kept its reputation for being the posh end of town. When it was first built, it was a haven for the better class families that resorts aspired to. Such visitors were seen as the most reliable and the best payers. And it may not surprise you to learn that when the town's first pier was built in 1863, it was intended to be a select promenade over the waves for those better class visitors. So much so that a charge of twopence was made for entry to keep the lower orders at bay. When the pier opened in May 1863, it was an immediate success, and not even the twopenny toll put off the hordes of trippers. On summer weekends, it became so crowded and socially mixed that plans were quickly made for a second pier to the south. This pier was deliberately intended to siphon off the lower class trippers and to enable the North Pier to maintain its social respectability. This second pier, or Central Pier as it's now called, soon became described as the People's Pier. Within 10 years of its opening, it was drawing in over 500,000 customers annually. In fact, it was the first big entertainment scheme in Blackpool, or anywhere else for that matter, to aim explicitly at working class custom. The People's Pier even carried advertising. This didn't upset its visitors and proved popular with businesses, so making the pier company even more money. The owner of the Wellington, a popular pub and hotel, gave the site for the pier entrance to the company that built it. He must have realised that he would benefit from the extra custom of all those visitors, and that this would be more than ample payment for his site in the end. It only cost a penny to get onto the Central Pier, and there was the chance of taking a cheap steam trip round the Isle of Man or to nearby resorts, but above all, it offered open-air dancing. This was only a simple affair, nothing elegant or refined, but it certainly catered for that holiday mood. This informal outdoor dancing really made the pier's name and fortune, and by the 1870s the Central Pier was as irredeemably brash as the North Pier was snobbishly refined. There were other developments taking place too, and once again the railways had a decisive role to play. A second station, Central Station, was opened. Although it's now been pulled down, it was only a couple of 100 yards from the entrance to the Central Pier. More and more streams of trippers began to flow along this stretch of promenade between Central Station and Central Pier. At that time, a terrace of respectable boarding houses with long front gardens lined the promenade. But during the 1880s, more and more of the householders gave way to the temptation to put up various stalls in front of their houses to cater for all those lovely trippers. And of course, those neighbours who wanted to hang on to their better class visitors complained bitterly about the noise. So they can't have been too pleased when a fairground was started on the beach in front of them. It became famous for such Victorian delights as fortune-telling, phrenology, telling your character from the bumps on your head, and chiropody. It was off with those boots and out with those corns, and in front of a fascinated audience too. Such were the origins of the famous Golden Mile. Over the years, it's seen many changes, but it's still one of the most famous Blackpool attractions. It's a place where silly hats and saucy t-shirts are definitely on the agenda, and people are determined to have a good time. Loud, boisterous, bustling, the Golden Mile will take your money in exchange for amusing you, just as it did in the Victorians' day. You'll still find fortune tellers here, but bingo, slot machines, discos and fast food have replaced the ventriloquists, shooting galleries and oyster stalls of the late 19th century. The Golden Mile was helped by being so close to the sands, but other areas had already begun to develop. Back in the 1870s, as Blackpool's popularity really got up to speed, it started to attract huge new speculative investments in entertainment. And this was one of those schemes, the Royal Palace Gardens, Raikes Hall. This was set up on a 51-acre site, half a mile inland from the sea. It consisted of a conservatory set in botanical gardens to offer respectable and improving recreations that would be attractive to the leisured classes. But it soon became clear that these kind of visitors were the worst paying portion of the grounds. And as you might expect, the people that did turn up were looking for excitement more than enlightenment. Once again, it was the open-air dancing that really packed people in, as well as the spectacular displays of fireworks. The masterstroke was to take place in 1874, when they managed to get a liquor licence which covered all 51 acres of the grounds. The outcome of that was that bars opened up everywhere. All pretensions and respectability were abandoned, and of course dividends soared to record levels. Although the owners were delighted, there were problems attached, which meant that not everyone took such a positive view. Unfortunately, Raikes Hall's increase in business applied to the criminal element as well. Pickpockets and prostitutes multiplied, creating controversy with Blackpool's civic leaders. In fact, the whole venture was to take on a cheerful notoriety completely at odds with the improving notions of recreation on which it had been set up. Back in the town centre, there was another speculative venture which had been forced to respond to the demands of the working class visitors, and unlike Raikes Hall, it still exists, the Winter Gardens. When it was opened in 1878, it was intended to provide a select indoor heated promenade with a display of exotic plants. It was to be a setting for formal concerts and other more refined activities to attract the middle class. But what this exuberant venture was really supposed to do was to encourage the development of a winter season. This was always a bit hopeful, given Blackpool's winter climate and the winds that swept the coastline. Yet again, to the management's surprise, even the sixpenny entrance fee provided no deterrent to the trippers, and they weren't slow to show their disapproval if they didn't like the music on offer. The management soon realised that what they needed to do to make the Winter Gardens profitable was to provide music hall entertainment. And after a female human cannonball featured as part of the Whitsun offering in 1879, the entertainments offered were said to become less and less refined. The seafront kept its social division and still prospered, while the central pier continued to make extra money through some fairly uninhibited advertising. Over on the North Pier, stylish new refreshment rooms had been built. The Indian Pavilion was the great delight of the decade. It was a fantasy of Oriental-style architecture, which, in its popular imagination of the time, had become linked with entertainment. The North Pier had its own orchestra, and to get into the concerts you had to pay a shilling. But there was to be no popular music or music hall variety shows here. Instead, the social high spot came in the Sunday morning after-service church parade. This is when the middle-class visitors competed to show off their hats and outfits and to display the fine detail of their prayer books. Meanwhile, down on the central pier, the trippers carried on dancing, and in ever-increasing numbers. What this great invasion of the working class visitors did for Blackpool was to encourage new kinds of building developments, as well as entertainments. The staggered holidays of the cotton towns, which had originated in traditional festivals, allowed the popular season to last from Burnley Fair in early July to Oldham Wakes in early September. And all those lovely visitors were going to need somewhere to stay. From the 1860s onwards, street upon street of purpose-built boarding houses began to radiate out from the railway stations. These houses near what was the central station really stand out. The Victorian working-class visitors, equipped with their tin trunks and brown paper parcels, could practically fall off the train and through these welcoming front doors. As you can see, these houses were built as high and deep as their owners could afford. But extensions upwards and backwards have continued over the years, with the local authority often turning a blind eye to the bylaws to allow the maximum number of visitors to be crammed in. If private profit was to be put before public health, then the Victorian visitors couldn't afford any better. Many of those visitors came from the cotton towns. There they may well have lived in cramped and crowded conditions, so these terraces may have had a familiarity with their home territory, but with a scale and colour that reminded people they were on holiday. The issue of the local government ignoring public health standards in these working-class boarding houses is a contrast to the official intervention that was to take place on the seafront. The new promenade, so essential to Blackpool's growth, was created by the local Board of Health. A private company had started the promenade tramway, which was a pioneer in its use of electricity. But it failed to invest in appropriate new technology, and when its trams broke down, they had to be pulled by horses. Eventually, Blackpool's corporation stepped in and took over responsibility for the tram service, and the trams still continue today.
There's also in the oxygen and Bovril in the brine. You talk about your dumbbells and your best port wine. Your heart begins to palpitate, your nose begins to shine. You feel your lungs expanding as you wander by the shore.
Blackpool's expansion throughout the century was far from straightforward. There were some furious conflicts about what sort of resort Blackpool ought to be. Despite complaints from those who wanted a different kind of holiday industry, Blackpool and its corporation were effectively taken over by the working-class holiday interests. By 1890, the domination of the centre of Blackpool by the popular holiday business was nearly complete. The 1890s saw the building of the town's famous tower, but let's not forget that despite Blackpool's fairground atmosphere, it hasn't really ever been just a working-class resort. It's never been able to run the risk of frightening away those middle-class families on whom its early prosperity had been based. If it was important to Victorian Blackpool to keep visitors in different social and cultural groups apart, then that's because these kind of class divisions mattered to mid and late Victorian England. Any resort that was solely for the working class would have been unlikely to survive, even in prosperous Lancashire. Its visitors were only too vulnerable to the economic depression and unemployment. And let's be realistic, there were nice middle-class visitors who enjoyed all the noise and bustle and who didn't object to a drink or two, just as there were teetotal working-class visitors whose idea of a good time was the chance to visit a different chapel. Class divisions aren't necessarily the same as cultural ones. But Blackpool was unique in both the range and scale of what it had on offer, and the sea remained its biggest attraction. The mention of high seas at Blackpool was enough to have the trains packed with day trippers. If sea bathing had been the cure-all at the start of the century, sea air had replaced it by the end. But amusement always came first, just like today.
Makes you feel that you don't care. There must be something in the seaside air.
Well, there you are, Blackpool past and present. That seems like a good note to end on, and the next time you go to the seaside, remember, have a look around. Those Victorians got everywhere. Bye-bye.
And for more information on Wide World issues, just call 099 55 5055 or write to Wide World at PO Box 55, London W12 8UE, and they will send you your very own free fact sheet.
The sea holds many mysteries, and now Channel 5 uncovers the secrets of the biggest marine adventure park in the world, SeaWorld. Meet the doctors.
It gives us the best feeling here in SeaWorld is to release an animal after working so hard to bring it back.
Meet the trainers.
Excellent!
And most important of all, meet the animals.
Are you a good boy?
SeaWorld, Mondays at 8:30 on 5.
Every weekend, 5 has something to skate about.
Sarah K. Wood!
It's called The Core.
Check it out.
Let's go.
Find The Core and a